I think a lot of people in Mississippi and Louisiana and this part of the Gulf Coast are very interested in the natural progression of their coastline and the fact that we're losing a lot of coastal land every day. A lot of people are worried that by introducing oil at high concentrations into these ecosystems, that it will inhibit the natural processes that trap sediment and help counterbalance the loss of these coastal environments. So our research will hopefully help determine whether geomorphologic changes, that's a fancy word for changes in the rate at which we gain or lose coastline, that will hopefully help us determine whether or not changes in these processes can be linked to the oil spill.
So here we are out in Bay Jimmy, which is on the northern part of Barataria Bay, and a lot of oil accumulated out here in Bay Jimmy. It came up through the passes. There are some passes that are due south, passes being the term down here for tidal inlets. The oil came through the passes and probably got washed ashore on the edge of these marshes under the influence of southerly winds. Over there you can see where the oil is and has been. Some of the darker spots over there are most likely still oil. You can see that the oil stayed in the front, let's say 5 to 10 yards of the marsh. This is something that seems to have been something of a widespread pattern. We've often talked about marshes as good traps and good filters, and this is probably the best example I've seen of it, is that the marsh grass has trapped much of the oil in the front 5 to 10 yards. So I think that while this spill was certainly a nightmare and a disaster, it has to be put in the context of a coast that is unfortunately in a state of degradation. So what we've got here is a bunch of plant stems and plant roots and old plant material, and this was most likely all marsh, some years ago, that has sunk into the sea. So this is part of the story of South Louisiana is right here in this anchor. You take the amount of shoreline that was oiled and you multiply it by the length of the width that was actually oiled. You multiply several hundred miles by something that's maybe 10 yards. You only get maybe on the order of 10 square miles or less of coastline that was impacted, which is incidentally less than the amount of coastline that we lose in an average year. We lose somewhere on the order of 25 square miles of coastline in an average year, and in a bad year, much more than that. In the month surrounding Katrina and Rita, the coast lost somewhere close to 250, maybe a little less than 250 square miles worth of land. One thing that you can see is that the oil did lead to some mortality of the marsh plants. You can see what appear to be some dead marsh plants. Over there, the brown marsh is most likely dead. You can also see in the middle over there, you can see some new shoots coming up. And those are most likely shoots that have come up since the oiling event. So it's most likely some regrowth after the marsh, after the oiling event. The basic story, I think, of what's going on is that the plant roots didn't die. One of the biggest concerns people had when this oil was when the spill was breaking, was would it kill the roots? And people asked myself and people asked other people, will everything die off? And a lot of people said it depends on what happens to the roots. If the roots die off, we could lose the marsh, and by extension, if the roots don't die off, things can regrow.
I think if we had proper restoration efforts in place decades ago, we would have had complete barrier islands like the Chandler Islands. We would have had complete marshes in the Biloxi marshes. And it's just the physical nature of things. You have more avenues for this oil to enter. So if we had complete marshes in the Biloxi marshes, yes, we still would have gotten damage, but so much of the interior marsh, which is very important for juvenile organisms to spawn, would still be intact. We probably would not have seen oil getting as far in as Lake Pontchartrain. It's just a matter of physics. If you had more physical boundaries between the oil and the interior marshes, we would have less problems. Now let me also say, though, that we need natural barriers. If you're throwing artificial barriers up there that will not be permanent, that are not held in place by plants and root systems, it's a waste of time. You need to support the natural restoration of the marshes and of the barrier islands.